Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Time is running out. In the 12 minutes it would take me to deliver this presentation, over 50 tonnes of topsoil will be lost in the UK alone. In 12 months' time, that figure will be around 2.2 million tonnes. The photo on the right is a typical image from the US Dust Bowl in the 1930s, an event that saw the loss of over 100 million acres of topsoil and 2.5 million people's livelihoods. I took the photo on the left in March this year, only a few miles from my farm. It shows Grade 1 peaty fen soils literally being blown away. If you remember only one thing from my presentation today, let it be that cover crops are the keystone to the healthy function of soil, without which we would not exist. Now, before I really get started, I would like to thank the Nuffield Farming Scholarships Trust, my kind sponsors, McDonald's, UK and Ireland, and my friends and family for their generous support along the way. I would also like to publicly apologise to my wife for leaving the family car stranded in Norway. More on that later. But my journey into cover cropping is a little less dramatic than watching the foundations of civilization blowing away. I came home from the army in 2015 to the family arable farm in Northamptonshire. Knowing absolutely nothing about farming, I assumed I could apply military logic, follow a template, issue orders, and the crops would grow nice and tall. How wrong I was. I soon learned that farming is as much an art as it is a science, completely open to interpretation and opinion. But what I quickly learned from my dad was the importance of looking after your soil. He had ditched the plough 15 years before and has since followed the mantra, let the worms do the work. The natural progression was for us to move from a shallow tillage to no tillage establishment system. And at the same time, I wanted to explore what place catch and cover crops could have on our farm. In the wet autumn of 2019, we had some initial success with direct drilling wheat into oilseed rape volunteers. The slugs ate the volunteers and left the wheat alone. However, the following spring, I tried direct drilling spring barley into an oat and oil radish cover crop. I lost over 1 tonne a hectare of barley compared to where I had desiccated the cover crop only a few weeks earlier. By now, I felt like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole, and I was by no means the only one. Cover cropping is more in vogue than ever before. There are new government schemes and a plethora of private financial incentives. But what I'd come to notice was the lack of practical detail that came with it. And so, along came Nuffield. I set out to explore the practicalities of catch and cover cropping, but I also wanted to understand the opportunities around them. For example, could we, and should we, reintegrate livestock onto the farm? Now, as an arable farmer who likes skiing, I find the thought of chasing sheep around all winter absolutely terrifying. Luckily for me, there are plenty of people out there who quite enjoy it. And more importantly, they know what they're doing. My first trip took me to Scandinavia. And in a bid to save money and reduce air miles, I decided to put a roof tent on the family car and drive to Norway. As is typical with Nuffield, you get to go to some incredible places. And I'll never forget camping on the edge of these amazing Swedish archipelagos. However, there is an old military saying that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and 24 hours later I was to find out exactly who that enemy was. Now, despite what my wife would say, this is probably the best thing that could have happened to me. Thanks to Elsa and Maren, 2 Norwegian farming advisors, I was very quickly welcomed into the lives and businesses of countless people, a theme that continued throughout my Nuffield travels. In fact, a few days later, I found myself on the side of a Norwegian mountain. No, not skiing, but chasing sheep. I left Scandinavia so impressed with what could be achieved through using clear objectives and timely establishment. Farmers there have a much shorter growing season than we do, with much harsher winters. Their challenge is to get something growing at all. And yet, they were able to achieve significant improvements in soil health. Slightly nervous of taking Land Rovers onto the continent, I decided to take the Eurostar to France. It was there I met farmers who really understood the importance of carbon and nitrogen cycling in their soils through the use of cover crops. These farmers were maximising the potential benefits of their cover crops by planting dense and diverse mixes, often with plenty of legumes. I saw that the method and timing of terminating the cover crop was one of the most important management factors. By rolling or mulching, they were putting the residues on the ground for the soil microbes to start breaking down. Doing this when the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the plants was optimally balanced for microbial decomposition, usually around the time the plants are midway through flowering. This helps the worms and the microbes start to cycle all those captured nutrients, ready for the next crop, while still protecting the soil. The phrase, "worms don't climb trees," beautifully summed this up to me. Over the last 2 years, I have visited a great number of UK farmers, all of them pioneering new and interesting ideas. I noticed that many of these farmers were layering up their land and businesses with multiple enterprises, integrating livestock, agroforestry, direct consumer marketing, and public engagement. They are, in my mind, farming layered and not naked. My very first Nuffield visit was to see Ed Horton in the Cotswolds. Ed and his father set out to make their business and soils more resilient and less dependent on artificial inputs and government subsidies. Ed has achieved this by fully integrating sheep into his arable rotation. Every single field is grazed at least once a year, whether it's on cover crops, oilseed rape, or even cereals. This integrated livestock approach, alongside wide rotations and using organic weed control techniques, has really allowed him to step off the high-input treadmill that so many of us are stuck on. But even more importantly, these practices have vastly improved his soils. It was on my travels in North America that everything started to come together for me, meeting farmers like Don Branton in New York State and Blake Vince, chair of Nuffield Canada. I was able to see firsthand how the adoption of no-till and cover cropping together had fundamentally changed their soils for the better, and how despite this, their neighbours were still sceptical of what they were doing. Blake told me about the social impact of farming differently to his neighbours, and how many won't even engage with him, and that you are never truly a prophet in your own town. But it was my visit to David Brandt in Ohio on a rainy morning in May this year that it finally all made sense to me. David had been no-tilling and cover cropping for over 50 years. There was nothing complicated about what he did. In fact, as he put it, all he did was plant the seed. For David, no answers came in a bottle. It was all down to the soil. He told me that with all his cover crop residues, every time it rained, he got compost tea. David's soils were so transformed over the years that they had been reclassified and had risen from 0.5% in organic matter to over 8%. After heavy rainfall the night before, he showed me the most beautifully crumbly and structured soil, alive with worms. This soil hadn't been beaten by tillage and suffered over-application of fertilizers and sprays. Instead, for 50 years, he had continued to feed it with plants and residues, allowing the soil's own ecosystem to thrive and support his crops. These practices had allowed David to reduce his inorganic fertilizer use by over 75%, profiting not only his business, but also the environment. David was essentially feeding his soils, and in turn, his soils were feeding his crops that were rich in nutrients. So much so that trial work had been done at Ohio State University, in which zinc-deficient patients were prescribed his corn flour, which was high in zinc, and it had worked. Now, some of you may know David sadly passed away less than 3 weeks after my visit. Reading the tributes, I realised how many farmers' lives he had influenced in his time. People like Blake counted him as a friend and a mentor. As I started the long journey home from North America, the practicalities of cover cropping had become clear to me. Going forward, I knew that for my cover crops to be successful, I first had to set clear objectives. I then needed to plan my cover crop mixes based on the functionality of each species, the diversity of the mix, and the density of the cover crop stand I was trying to achieve. Different objectives will influence each of these areas, so when planning a cover crop, remember FDD, functionality, diversity, and density. But change takes time. I now view cover cropping as akin to topping up a piggy bank, saving the pennies, and in time reaping the rewards, investing now to build resilient and profitable soils, like so many farmers I visited. I've made it my mission at home to continually cover as much of the soil as possible. For my business to be sustainable and profitable, I can't afford not to. This year, with a bit of luck and rain, we've had our best covers yet. So on my travels, I have seen a multitude of great reasons for growing cover crops. Many of them are interlinked. It could be for erosion prevention, water management, air quality, soil improvement, weed and pest control, livestock, foraging, habitat creation, nutrient cycling, financial benefits, or maybe even just the pretty flowers. But ultimately, I find the most compelling reason is to keep the soil alive. There are more living organisms in a spade of soil than humans on Earth. In fact, a recent report suggested that the soil is home to well over half of all living organisms. And so I come back to where I started, to remind you that cover crops are the keystone to the healthy function of soil. Biologically, plants are pumping carbon out of the atmosphere and converting it to food. Through their roots, they are feeding fungi and bacteria in exchange for nutrients. Decaying plant residues are a feast for these soil microbes. And it is this microbial biomass, along with decomposed plant materials, that account for most of our soil organic matter. Structurally, plant roots shrink and swell while penetrating deep through compacted layers, creating soil structure. Worms that feed on surface plant residues create drainage channels, helping to improve water management. Chemically, plants access and cycle nutrients, making them less prone to leaching and more available to the subsequent crop, while legumes can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, helping to reduce our dependence on artificial fertilizers. Soil and plants are fundamentally linked. Neither can survive without the other, and we depend on their survival for our own existence. There is a great quote from the book, Chasing the Red Queen, a book which, funnily enough, many farmers I met recommended I read, and I recommend you do too. It goes, when plants are removed, soils suffer. When soils are damaged, plants suffer. So as farmers, we have a choice, life or death. We must stop destroying our soils and instead start building them. It takes 12 minutes to lose 50 tonnes of topsoil in the UK. It'll take generations to build it back. And yet there are 12 months of the year that we can choose to protect the soil and to grow something. Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, our soils are alive. So let's feed them. Thank you.